This is a high-grade special on gender equality in mining. The United Nations has embedded gender equality in their Sustainable Development Goals, social justice, or simple economics. I ask Caroline Ngonze of the UNDP how their 2030 agenda links to gender equality in the extractives. Caroline, welcome to Highgrade.
Thank you for having me.
The UN takes gender equality seriously. It's one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And it's a basic question, but how do you define gender equality?
Basically, gender equality would be ensuring access to opportunities, equal participation for women and men, to ensure that there are no hindrances or barriers that prevent women from taking advantage of the opportunities therein.
I'd like to dive into Africa with you today. How would you describe the gender agenda on the continent currently?
Basically, the gender agenda is a mixed patchwork, so to speak, right now.
It's a big continent.
Exactly. And there's been massive progress since the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, yet there are still some indicators that are lagging behind. So I will, in terms of the three key groupings, women's participation in political processes, we've seen massive improvement in Africa. Right now we have countries that are leading in parliamentary representation of women. We have Rwanda at 61%, Namibia at 49%, South Africa, Senegal in the 40s. So under women political participation at the national level and local government level, massive progress has been achieved. In terms of the social sectors, education, health, primary education in Africa right now, there's almost near gender parity at primary level, which is a good thing. At secondary level, that is where the problem is. Secondary and tertiary, the completion rates for girls are much lower than for boys. In terms of access to healthcare, massive progress in terms of maternal mortality. We've seen since the MDGs a 44% decrease in maternal mortality, but we still have the unmet need for family planning. When you get into the economics, now that's where the real test is in the pudding, so to speak. Basically, economically, we have seen in Africa lack of participation of women in national economies actually has led to a loss of almost 95% billion US dollars in lost productivity per year. So it's looking at how the women are really not having a conducive environment to play, so to speak, in the economic sector.
And what about the extractives? Are they worse or better off than what you just described?
Basically, in the extractives, unfortunately, the picture seems to be worse than what we are describing. I'll break it down into the large-scale mining sector and the small-scale mining sector. Large-scale mining sector is mostly dominated by men. Women have fewer employment opportunities there. But in the artisanal and small-scale sector, women are disproportionately represented. We do know right now in Africa, women make up between 40 and 50% of artisanal and small-scale miners. Amongst the 12 million miners we have, conservative estimates in Africa. So that's like a huge, huge number. And unfortunately, many of these women are at the bottom of the value chain, meaning what they get out of the extractives value chain is very minimal compared to what they could get because of their positioning, where are the entry points.
You mentioned workforce and women in the workforce. When you look at the extractives, for a lot of men, that can be a lucrative career, from working on mine sites to managerial jobs. What do you say? Can women compete with men for these positions? Yes,
I would say yes, and still also group that into large-scale mining and small-scale mining. Yeah. In the large-scale mining sector, it is possible. What is required is a whole structural change in access to science, STEM education for girls, science, technology, engineering, and math education, how girls are mentored, sponsored to get through the system. That way we have a pipeline of women who are qualified to compete at the same level with the men. And a good example of that would be a university we have worked with called the University of Mines and Technologies in Takwa, Ghana, who actually have a gender equality strategy for the mining sector. So they have specific gender equality objectives and indicators to ensure access to women to the university, and the actual mentoring and coaching and sponsorship throughout, and access to opportunities for internship, access to job attachments that actually get women on the way to competing in this case.
What do you think about targets? Having 50-50 workforce as a target, for example?
That is a very good aspirational target. Not sure how many mining companies have achieved that so far. We do know the initiatives to actually try to achieve that, some with success, others without too much success. But there's anecdotal evidence, particularly in South Africa, where we have seen mining companies putting specific units and divisions that are female only that outperform the divisions that are male only. So we can see there's examples that can be borrowed by other companies to see what works and what would not work in the sector.
So then, talking about artisanal and small-scale mining, what is life like for a woman working as an artisanal miner?
In artisanal and small-scale mining, basically is a sector that is disproportionately impacting women, because women make up a large majority of the workforce, between 40 and 50% of 12 million people in artisanal and small-scale mining. So the women we work with tell us about the delicate balance between their reproductive roles and their productive roles. Reproductive roles meaning the unpaid care work they have to do before they go to the mine site. So in the morning they have to get up, get water, prepare children to go to school, which eats up the time they would actually concentrate to mining activities to get income, which means that what they earn from the mining sector is lower than what a man would earn, because the man has spent more hours at the mine site compared to the women. Another key issue they have mentioned in terms of the productive work is really their positioning in the mining value chain. Most of them are positioned at the tail end of the mining value chain, meaning what they earn from it is really very little compared to men, hence the gender pay gap of 28% currently right now. Development minerals are minerals and materials that are mined, processed and used locally in sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, housing, energy. So these are local materials for local development, and we see a lot of women represented in this sector. Basically, the women in this sector are also telling us that the information asymmetry. When there are mining concessions to be given out, information does not trickle down to them, because many of them are in the rural provinces. This information is in the capitals. So mainly it's the men miners who actually get the information, put in applications. Women get to hear about the concessions way later, so they miss out on concessions. So that's why you see there's a huge disparity between women with mining concessions and men with mining concessions, basically. Women have also told us the problem of lack of access to finance. Basically, this is linked to their lack of productive resources. They have no mining concessions, so they cannot go to the bank to ask for credit, because they have nothing to act as collateral, so to speak. Women are also telling us about difficulties in getting geodata on the production in their concessions, which means that they have no idea how much production they still have left. They have no idea about the reserves, and with that they cannot put together a bankable document for access to finance, which means they don't get finance to upgrade their equipment, to improve their productivity. So it becomes a cyclical circle of poverty in the sector, unfortunately. Another key issue that has come out as a challenge is socio-cultural norms in the mining communities. Particularly in a place like Tanzania, where they say the socio-cultural norms prevent them from actually going, sometimes for those who do small-scale mining of gold, getting into the shafts. Social cultural norms prevent them from going down, so they do not know what they have gotten as gold. So many times they are cheated by the men who actually go down the shafts to retrieve the gold. So there are also social cultural norms coming into play as well.
What about communities living around mining operations? There are studies suggesting that women actually benefit less and suffer more. What do you say? Are men and women impacted in the same way?
In the extractives communities, unfortunately, women disproportionately bear the brunt of the negative impacts.
Can you give some examples?
In case of where we have negative environmental impacts that compromise the quality of water, access to agricultural land, we see women, because of their roles in the family, they have to take care of the water. They have no access to water, so they end up going longer distances to look for water, which reduces the time they use for other economically gainful activities. In terms of affordable housing, in case of resettlement, we do know many times men as owners of land do get the resettlement compensation to the exclusion of women. So sometimes women are left really in flux, so to speak, in terms of this. So for issues of food security as well, when they have no access to agricultural land or no access to economic activities to get income for food in the households, we see issues of food insecurity impacting women more than they would men in the extractive, so to speak.
And what do you see the role is here for extractives companies? They come in maybe with a different set of values. Should they come in and try to change cultural patterns in the communities? Basically,
that would be a recipe for disaster when an outsider comes in and tries to change, because the change has to be ingrown. There has to be a lot of community engagement. Basically, participatory community engagement that is not token-like, where both men and women in the community actually sit down with these companies to discuss what are the community needs, how will the extractives company impact on the women and on the men differentially, so to speak.
I'm interested in your opinion why there are these gender inequalities, and not just in artisanal small-scale mining, but large-scale mining as well.
This can all be traced to the underlying structural norms that determine the unequal power relations between men and women in the sector. These unequal power relations actually determine the social norms and roles, what women can and cannot do, the division of labor in the house, basically their role in childcare, income generating activities, and their political leadership and leadership in any other social cultural things. So all these underlying structural issues brought about by unequal power relations would be the genesis of all this gender equality in the sector.
Will gender equality automatically follow from economic development, or do you have to look at gender equality as a topic by itself?
Basically, for gender equality, would have to be standalone as a topic and also mainstreamed, like they're doing for the SDGs. Because
sounds complicated.
Because standalone, what we see when you do standalone gender initiatives, everybody says that's a woman thing. So that's brushed aside, it's a woman thing, so nobody really thinks too much about it. So basically, it has to be both standalone programming that actually redresses previous inequalities and gets women the practical support they need, as well as also mainstreamed throughout. That way we take care of the strategic needs of women, whether it's access to education, access to finance, access to legal redress and things like that. So it's both standalone and mainstreamed.
And speaking of solutions and what needs to be done, what are UNDP's policy recommendations to increase gender equality?
UNDP's recommendations for gender equality, particularly for the extractive sector, the ACPU Development Minerals Program, basically falls under 4 key pillars. The first pillar would be support to actually review and revise legal frameworks that are discriminatory to women in the extractive sector. The second pillar would be having more programs, more standalone programs that are also mainstreamed for women in the extractives to ensure that they actually participate in and benefit from the sector as they should. The third pillar would be more data, more empirical data, sex and age disaggregated data to inform policies and programs to see what works for women in the sector. And the fourth pillar would be greater accountability for the legal frameworks that are already in place, greater accountability for their enforcement to see, is this being enforced to ensure that women actually benefit from the sector as they should.
How far will we have come by 2030?
If there's a transformative shift, we will actually achieve our targets. But at the pace we are at right now, unless there's a transformative shift, we will not meet any of our targets by 2030, which is just slightly over 10 years from now. So a lot needs to be done.
This is Highgrade.